I am ex-Detective Inspector Walter Henry Thompson and was Winston Churchill's bodyguard for a period of nearly 18 years.
In almost any piece of film you'll see of Britain's great wartime leader, this is the man in the background, anonymous and secret. Until now, his critical role in saving the life of Churchill from a series of attacks has been hidden from the wider public.
He himself intended that he would never be taken alive, and he issued direct instructions to me. I was to have his 4.5 Colt fully loaded. He intended to use every bullet but one on the enemy. The last one he saved for himself.
After the war, Walter Thompson's censored book told just part of the story. His full memoirs were suppressed even by Churchill himself. Only now can we recount the number of assassination attempts on Churchill's life, many foiled by Walter. This series, with unique access to these incredible memoirs, reveals for the first time the story of Walter's life with Winston. Together they traveled thousands of miles on precarious journeys to meet Stalin and Roosevelt and other world leaders. Together they rode with Lawrence of Arabia, dodged German assassins, were nearly shot down by enemy aircraft, lone gunmen, U-boats, and IRA hitmen. This is a story of the political upheavals of the 20th century. Churchill's constant brushes with death and the role played by an ex-post office messenger in preventing an early end to his life.
And with this weapon, he was a dead shot. Anyone that came within range of this weapon would never survive.
After the foiled assassination attempt at the Baltimore dock and the perils of another Atlantic crossing, Walter and Winston were soon on their dangerous travels again. For the quickest way to get to Moscow to see Joseph Stalin, which Winston was now determined to do, involved going across North Africa, where the aircraft of the German Luftwaffe controlled large areas. After braving an accident or shoot-down, there was always the lurking danger of enemy agents wherever they landed. In July 1942, Winston was faced with two urgent problems. In North Africa, Erwin Rommel and his Africa Corps had driven the British 8th Army back deep into Egypt. Simultaneously in Russia, a massive new German offensive was again pushing the Soviet army back. Stalin was urgently demanding a landing in northwest Europe to relieve some of the pressure. Winston courageously decided to tackle both problems by flying first to Cairo to reorganize the command structure there, and then to go on to Moscow to explain to Stalin face-to-face that a landing in northwest Europe could not be undertaken soon. Being Winston, he did nothing to make the job of those who had to look after him easy. And Walter, somewhat wearily, remarked,
Winston adopted his usual practice of ignoring advice which he did not want to follow. It was understood that the Liberator on which we were passengers was to proceed down the west coast of Africa. But Mr. Churchill, at the last minute, cancelled these instructions and after Gibraltar, flew direct to Cairo by the shortest route.
This took their aircraft across Algiers and Libya, well within range of the Luftwaffe fighters in North Africa. But Winston's luck held, and they got through safely. This was the first time that Walter and Winston used the new 4-engined Liberator bomber, which had been adapted as a somewhat crude long-range VIP carrier.
At times, the plane was like an icebox, and at others, the heat was well nigh intolerable. An improvised table was made up of boxes and some of our baggage, and there we would have our meals on the various journeys. Little room was available to walk about, and sometimes many hours were spent in this cooped-up manner. My greatest surprise was the fact that Winston put up with so much discomfort in this plane, drafty and cold as it mainly was.
It was even more impressive when one remembers that Winston was by then 67 and used to a lifetime of luxury travel. Once safely on the ground, Winston was straight into action.
Long conferences were held, as a result of which changes were made. General Alexander was put in charge of the Near East Command. The command of the 8th Army was now given to General Montgomery.
Winston's first choice to command the 8th Army was General William Strafer Gott, but he was shot down by the Luftwaffe on his way back to Cairo. His plane was following precisely the same route that Winston's had taken only a couple of days earlier, and Walter must have felt that this underlined the very considerable risks which his boss was taking. Having made his changes to the command of 8th Army, Winston and his parties set off for the second stage of their journey. The flight, with a refueling stop at Tehran, took a grueling 16.5 hours before Moscow was reached.
Eventually, we touched down at Moscow Airport. After an inspection of a guard of honor, we were led to a large car and driven at an extremely fast speed through Moscow to a secret retreat of Stalin's some distance outside the city.
The British party was then installed in a heavily guarded villa.
We all felt very uneasy in this building, this being aggravated by the manner in which members of the household staff would suddenly appear in any part of it if any of our party were in conversation. We subsequently learned that every member of the household staff spoke perfect English. Winston called me and said, "Let's go outside. Maybe we can safely talk there." On emerging into the grounds and looking around, we saw plainclothes men patrolling every direction. Winston said, "We can't talk here, Thompson. Let's go inside." We re-entered the villa and went into Winston's bedroom, where he asked me if I'd searched the room for microphones. After I'd told him how impossible it would be to trace them all, he made an amusing decision. "I will send them a message," he declared. With that, he stamped his foot on the ground and said, "This is Winston Churchill speaking. If you have microphones in my room, it is a waste of time. I do not talk in my sleep." He then grinned at me and said, "I'd better tell them again in the other room." This he did. Our entrance to the Kremlin was hampered by checks by security guards, a large number of whom followed us right into the building itself. Winston left us and went with Stalin into the latter's room. The other members of our party were shown into another room from which I could see the door of Stalin's room. Suddenly, an attendant signalled to us, and at that moment Winston came out of Stalin's room with considerable momentum and looking very displeased. Behind him I could see Stalin, and the look on his face was one of intense fury. Apparently the meeting, which had commenced quite cordially, had broken up over a decision voiced by Winston which was not to Stalin's liking.
This was probably when Winston came to the crunch point of explaining to Stalin that there was no way a second front landing in northwest Europe would be feasible during 1942. We returned to our villa with a very displeased Winston.
A further meeting between the two principals seemed for the moment to be out of the question, and Winston chafed at the delay. For the next 2 days, business was left to the military chiefs. We did nothing, and the time was simply wasted until we received an invitation to a banquet at the Kremlin.
This turned out to be a lavish and lengthy affair, at which so many toasts were drunk that it seemed that it would never end.
At last, the end of the meal came, and Stalin made a speech of welcome. Up to this time, Winston had taken matters fairly quietly. But when we left the banqueting hall and entered an anteroom where champagne, liqueurs and coffee were being served, he commenced walking up and down, looking extremely displeased, as it was apparent that no talks were imminent.
Stalin's interpreter Pavlov was given a message that Winston wanted to get down to talks right away.
Stalin was standing at the end of the room, calmly smoking a cigarette in a long holder. I watched his face as the message was given to him, and as he answered, he was undoubtedly very pleased with himself. But his reply greatly displeased Winston. "You are Mr. Stalin's guests," came the reply. "You are here to enjoy yourselves. Mr. Stalin is enjoying himself, but he does not intend to have any meetings tonight." Winston almost exploded. This was one of the few times when I've really seen him angry. Turning to our ambassador, Winston made clear the fact that his plane would leave on Sunday morning, and that if Stalin wanted to talk, he knew where to find us. With that, he turned on his heel and walked out, Stalin catching up as Winston was entering his car. Winston looked at Stalin and his chiefs, appeared to toss his head in the air, then turned and entered the car, and we left. I had noticed the surprise on Stalin's face, but I feel that by what followed there and at other conferences, he had learned to respect Winston as a strong man.
The next morning, Saturday, Stalin asked Winston to meet him for a man-to-man session at the Kremlin that evening with only interpreters present. Winston told Walter that it would probably only take about an hour. Winston did not emerge until 2:20 in the morning. His dinner had gone on into a drinking session for which Molotov was brought in. He had a headache and had only time for a quick bath before leaving for the airport. On the way back to the El Alamein battlefront, Walter was even more on edge, knowing Winston's instinct for exposing himself to danger. Back in Cairo, Winston went to visit General Montgomery at his forward headquarters and was impressed by his plans to thwart Rommel's next attempt to break through. He was also taken on several visits of inspection to units of the 8th Army. Being near the enemy always brought out the worst in Winston as far as Walter was concerned. But he was beginning to learn how to control his boss, as he showed while visiting the New Zealand division commanded by General Freiberg, which was holding the southern section of the front.
When we arrived, Winston asked where the front line was. At that time, an occasional shell was coming over from the enemy. On the general pointing it out, Winston commenced to walk in that direction. The general's efforts to stop him were of no avail. He knew me and turned back towards me, saying, "We must stop him. A shell may come this way at any time." I suggested that if he told Winston it was his duty to see him safely away from the front, it should have the desired effect. Over the years, I'd found that duty to Winston is something which, if carried out, will have his unlimited support. The general spoke to Winston, who stopped, then turned and started to come back. As he did so, he gave me an impish look, which told me plainly that he knew I was responsible for the general using the magic word.
Winston and Walter flew back to Britain on the 21st of August, by the same route they had come out. Once again, despite marauding Luftwaffe fighters, they got through without any problems. Just over a week later, Rommel's predicted offensive to outflank the Eighth Army and break through to Cairo began. The Afrika Korps was stopped in its tracks. After 2 days of heavy fighting, Rommel pulled back and began to build a formidable defensive position from the railway halt of El Alamein to the impassable Katara Depression, 35 miles to its south. It was 3 months before Montgomery felt ready to launch his crucial assault. But on the 4th of November, after 12 days of bitter fighting, the British finally broke through, and the Axis forces began to pull back. 4 days later, US and British forces landed in Algeria and French Morocco and began to advance towards Tunisia. Rommel's forces risked being cut off, and German reinforcements, which might have turned the tide at El Alamein a week earlier, were soon being poured into Tunisia.
In November 1942, the invasion of North Africa occupied Winston's mind, especially as with the advance into Libya, we had gone from retreat to attack.
The steady advance of the Eighth Army and the success of Operation Torch meant that 2 questions needed to be settled urgently. The first was where next to attack in the Mediterranean once North Africa had been cleared. The second was to decide who would now govern the liberated French territories and in effect become representative of a free French government.
The Casablanca Conference now offered an opportunity to deal with this complex problem, and on January the 12th, 1943, the British mission arrived at Casablanca, where a conference was to be held between Winston and President Roosevelt. And I feel fairly certain that the main issue was between General de Gaulle and General Giraud.
Walter and Winston traveled to Casablanca in their Liberator. By now they were both used to its discomforts and dangers. But for President Roosevelt, it was the first time he had flown since first elected some 10 years earlier.
The main meetings were held in the Angfa Hotel, and some of the villas surrounding the hotel were used to house the visiting delegations. The whole area, which was on top of a hill and some distance from the town of Casablanca, being surrounded by barbed wire.
Casablanca seethed with Axis agents and dubious characters who would do anything, even murder, to earn a quick Reichsmark. Walter and his fellow security officers were deeply concerned at how vulnerable the Allied leaders would be and strictly forbade anyone to leave the guarded area. Inevitably, Winston chose to treat these instructions with his usual indifference. Always obsessed with bathing, the sea proved an irresistible attraction, and he came near to getting himself killed for his pleasures.
After a conference at the hotel a few days later, he decided to walk down to the sea and return to the villa by another route. However, on arriving near our compound, he saw the villa, but the rolls of barbed wire were between us and it. I said, "I'm afraid we shall have to go back the other way, sir." This meant quite a trip around, and as he saw the villa only a short distance away, he said, "We can climb over that," and promptly proceeded to do so. I had no intention of going through, but Winston forced his way through first, and I followed through the gap he had made. Suddenly, there was a shout of halt, and we found ourselves looking down the barrels of some Tommy guns held by the American sentries. An American officer came up and soundly reproved Winston, telling us that his men had orders to fire upon anyone attempting to pass through the wire. Winston stood with his head down whilst the officer was speaking, after which he looked up, thanked the officer and said, "You are quite right. I was extremely foolish. I should have gone back." He then turned to the officer and asked him to accompany him to the president's villa. The president was in the garden at the rear of the villa. On looking at the officer, I noticed how disturbed he appeared to be. "Mr. President," Winston said, "your officer has just given me a severe reprimand." "Surely not," said the president. "I am entirely to blame," continued Winston. "I came through the barbed wire. I was too tired to walk back. It was too far." Winston then turned to the officer and thanked him for taking care of him. But as the officer left, the president added his remarks by saying, "Winston, you should be ashamed. My orders are to shoot anyone passing through the wire." They both smiled, but as we returned to our villa, Winston was extremely subdued.
On the rare occasions that Winston did go out of the guarded area, Walter was even more on edge. For French memories of the sinking of their fleet on Winston's instructions were still fresh. Many officers and men would probably relish the opportunity to get revenge.
Whilst we were in Casablanca, Winston visited the French battleship Jean Bart, which was being repaired in the harbour. He did not go aboard, which gave me much comfort. For as we walked along the side of the ship, the sailors on guard looked at the Prime Minister with sullen indifference. Perhaps they did not recognise him, but I and my colleague kept a wary eye upon them until we returned to our villa.
The conference ended with the declaration that the Allies were only interested in the unconditional surrender of all the Axis powers, and a semi-alliance between de Gaulle and Giraud to work together to achieve the liberation of France. The two leaders then visited Marrakesh and stayed at the Mamounia Hotel. Here Winston painted his only wartime work.
The president left for America and our party for Cairo. One morning, Winston came up to me with a great air of mystery. "Do you know where we're going tomorrow?" he asked. I did not, and he added with a chuckle, "I'll tell you in the morning." He seemed unusually pleased and quite excited. We were off to Turkey to meet President İnönü.
They flew to Adana in southeastern Turkey, where the talks were friendly, but Winston was unable to persuade the Turks to enter the war on the Allied side.
After the conference, we had a memorable day in Nicosia, where Winston made a speech to a vast crowd in the grounds of Government House, after which we drove through the town. By the time the car reached the outskirts, we looked like a vast bouquet of flowers. They had been thrown into the car from all sides. It was a triumphal procession and thoroughly enjoyed by Winston.
This triumphal procession was to continue for another 2,000 miles as they flew to Cairo, and then caught up with the 8th Army, which had now pushed as far as the border of Tunisia.
We then went on to General Montgomery's headquarters at Tripoli. We flew reasonably low across the desert, following the route taken by the 8th Army from El Alamein to Tripoli. The supply vehicles on the road looked like an army of ants, and the mass of wrecked vehicles gave proof of the massive bombardment to which they had been subjected. Friday, February the 5th, 1943 was a day to remember. It was fine and warm, and as we drove into Tripoli, the troops on the route were compelled to force back the Italians who wanted to get a glimpse of Winston. To our surprise, they waved and cheered as he passed. Later, there was a march past. What a march it was, being reviewed by Winston and the General. These were some of the 8th Army who had fought from El Alamein to Tripoli. Their vehicles looked as if they'd just come out of barracks, shining like new. Their boots were polished, their trousers pressed, their equipment clean, and their heads held high. Later, Winston addressed the troops. during which he said that they reminded him of the well-known hymn, "Each night you pitch your moving tent, a day's march nearer home." We had all had an extremely tiring time, but everybody's spirits were very high. The war was turning in our favour.
But Walter's pleasure must have been dimmed by the knowledge that the enemy was well aware of where Winston now was. Before flying home after his triumphant visit to the 8th Army, Winston was anxious to call on the Allied commander, General Eisenhower, at his headquarters in Algiers. Walter was less keen, for a report had come in that a prominent German agent was in the city, and that an attempt was to be made on the Prime Minister's life. Winston insisted on going. On arrival, he was driven into Algiers by a roundabout route in a bulletproof car with its windows smeared with mud. General Eisenhower was extremely uneasy at the reports of an assassination attempt and desperate to get his VIP guest out of the city alive. He was certain that the Prime Minister's presence was well known to the enemy. To divert attention from the Prime Minister's night flight, he ordered his own B-17 to be prepared ostentatiously for a special journey. His naval aide, Captain Butcher, then played out a charade of driving out in an armoured convoy and apparently smuggling people on board the plane, which then took off. The next day, shielded by this deception, Winston's Liberator flew safely back to Britain. Within 2 weeks, both Walter, Winston, and 5 other members of the group had come down with double pneumonia, probably picked up in Tripoli. But for Walter, worse was soon to follow.
On Friday, we were standing by to go down to Chequers for the weekend, when one of the secretaries told me that we should not be going for at least an hour and suggested we went for tea. I had some friends staying in the rooms which I use from time to time, and I asked them to get tea for me. There was a direct line from these rooms to Downing Street, and I'd finished tea with time to spare before we should be leaving when the telephone rang. I was told that the Prime Minister was ready to start and that the police car was being sent for me. In answering the telephone, I leaned across the back of a very wide settee. But after putting the telephone down, as I stood up, my automatic pistol fell out of its holster, hit the ground, and fired a bullet through both my legs. The safety catch was faulty. After telephoning to Scotland Yard, I was taken to St Thomas's Hospital, where the bullet was taken from the top of my thigh. The news was censored as quickly as possible, but one paper managed to get it out before they were stopped. Haw Haw made much of the incident, saying that there had been a riot in London demanding that Winston stop the war and sued for peace, and in protecting him, I had been shot.
Walter made little of the accident, partly perhaps from his own embarrassment at having shot himself. But the main reason must have been that while he was convalescing in a police nursing home in Hove on the Sussex coast, he received dreadful news. His son Fred, who was flying with RAF Bomber Command's elite Pathfinder force, was missing in action. This was followed swiftly by a telegram from Winston. I am most deeply grieved to hear that your gallant son is reported missing after he gained a bar to his DFC. Stop. You have my profound sympathy in your sorrow and pride. 3 days later, Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command, wrote, I personally feel confident in all the circumstances that he will turn up as a prisoner. or that he may even be in the hands of friendly people in France. Keep a stiff upper lip. But Harris had been too hopeful. 2 weeks later, the International Red Cross confirmed that Fred had been killed. What was particularly hard to take was that Fred had completed his tour of 42 missions, but had volunteered to go on one last mission. Walter's middle son, Fred was always his father's favorite. Academically outstanding, he had followed his father into the police force and joined Special Branch as war began. Early in 1941, Fred joined the RAF. Commissioned as a navigator with Bomber Command, he had joined the Pathfinder Force when it was set up in August 1942. Walter never wrote in his journal or any of his books about his son's death, but he did dedicate the book he published in 1951 to him. Walter was worried that Winston wouldn't want him back, but there was never any question of that.
I was due to return to London after my convalescence at the weekend. But 2 days early, I received a telephone call from Scotland Yard as to my fitness and instructing me to return the following morning. This was at Winston's request, as another trip to the United States and Canada was imminent.
After the pneumonia, Lord Moran had insisted that Winston must not fly. Instead, he and Walter travelled by the liner Queen Mary, which was sailing for New York to pick up US troops. The security problem was greater than usual. The German embassy in Dublin was known to have contacts with merchant seamen in British ports, and it was likely that the sailing of the liner was reported. She was escorted across the Atlantic first by 4 British cruisers and then by 2 American destroyers. Walter had been instructed by Scotland Yard that if the Queen Mary were struck by a U-boat, Winston was to be the first into the lifeboat. Despite these forebodings, Winston was able to get what Walter saw as a very vital rest cure.
He not only rested, but also read some books, a sure sign that he was relaxing.
The Trident Conference saw much argument between the British and Americans as to whether there was any need to invade Italy. The US Chiefs of Staff were convinced that everything should now be devoted to a landing in northwest Europe. Winston was desperate to attack the soft underbelly of the Nazi Reich, as he called Italy. It was to achieve this that he set off on another transatlantic flying boat journey with Walter and General George Marshall, the chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, for a discussion with General Eisenhower, the Allied commander in the Mediterranean. The flight from Washington to Newfoundland took 8 hours, and the hop across the ocean, 17. Winston spent much of it asleep in what he called the bridal suite, and missed the excitement of the plane being struck by lightning en route.
We made our way to Gibraltar and on to Algiers. There, a conference was held with Mr. Eden and all the principal army generals of England, the United States and France. These discussions were cloaked in secrecy, especially so as for the first time during the whole period of the war, the Germans knew the date of our departure from England and that we were going to the United States.
The result of the discussions delighted Winston, for Eisenhower was as enthusiastic as he was to open a second front in Italy and won General Marshall over. As the party set off on the journey back to England, Walter recounts a strange incident.
At Maison Blanche Aerodrome, late at night, we entered the Liberator, which was to take us home. Whilst the engines were being warmed up, it was found that one of them was not responding. Winston was informed, and although he was told that it was probably a magneto and could be replaced, we waited. And during a discussion, he asked me, "Do you think we should risk it, Thompson?" With that, we left the plane and stayed the night with Admiral Cunningham.
So far, so straightforward. A mechanical hitch, and a sensible decision to postpone leaving so that it could be properly sorted out. But just after the war ended, came a strange new revelation.
There was an extraordinary statement made in connection with this incident in the war diary of Captain Butcher, naval aide to General Eisenhower. He affirmed that the Prime Minister secretly sent one of his personal detectives to remove a magneto from the Liberator.
This part of Captain Butcher's diary was serialized in the Sunday Express newspaper in Britain on the 3rd of March 1946. This brought immediate rebuttals from Winston himself, who wondered why he would have had to go to such lengths to stop himself travelling when he could simply have said no. Walter poured scorn on the idea along the same lines.
This is not true. Neither does there seem any point to the story. If Winston had not wished to return to London that day, he would definitely have said so. He would certainly not have allowed, let alone ordered, a detective with no specialised knowledge to interfere with any part of an aircraft.
Despite these denials, Walter's son Harold confirmed many years later that not only did his father have the necessary knowledge to disable the plane, but that he had done so. Dad talked about Churchill all the time, but never about things that Churchill wanted kept secret or things he thought other people shouldn't know. But he suddenly told me one day, when we were working at the garage together. In fact, he didn't remove a magneto wire. He took the rotor from the distributor cap. I've no doubt he did it. Dad knew his engines. It would have taken seconds, and nobody would have been any the wiser. Also, Captain Butcher refers to Captain Shaw, Admiral Cunningham's flag secretary, as the source of his information. Two such senior officers are unlikely to have invented such a story, and recently a possible explanation for the mystery has emerged, which is revealed here for the first time. The truth about Walter's actions on that night at Maison Blanche airfield grew murkier when it emerged that in putting down this story in his journal some years later, Walter had got confused. He and Churchill flew from Algiers on 2 occasions during the first 6 months of 1943, in February and then again in June. On both occasions, it appears that he was the only bodyguard on the trip. It is now certain that it was in February, after the visit to General Eisenhower in Algiers, that the Liberator they were flying in had its magneto problem and their flight home had to be delayed. For by June, Winston and Walter would have been flying in a different plane. It was their first flight in an RAF Avro York 4-engine transport named Ascalon. It all seemed a mystery until, many years later, information emerged which may account not only for Butcher's story, but also the vehemence with which it was denied, and Walter's confusion of the dates. In 1974, the secret of Ultra was revealed, how British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park had broken the German Enigma codes and been able to supply Winston and a select few of his top commanders with a stream of top-secret German messages. Throughout the war, Churchill was desperate to protect this secret. He always insisted that any plan or operation undertaken as a result of information obtained via Ultra must have a cover story so that the Germans would never suspect a British coup. If he had received information from Bletchley Park that an attempt was to be made to shoot down his aircraft, what better cover story could there be than a mechanical fault? And who better to carry it out than his faithful bodyguard? Walter would not need to have known about Ultra, and the news of the breaking of the German codes did not come out until shortly before his death. He would have obeyed Winston's instructions unquestioningly, including the vow of perpetual silence. At one stage, Walter remarks in his journal,
Did Winston have a premonition of danger? According to the engineer on the plane, the trouble could have been put right in an hour or so, but he decided not to go. This was one of many occasions when his foresight appeared to save him from harm.
Possibly the foresight had a rather more factual source. The likelihood becomes greater when one considers the way Walter continues his account.
That night, when we should have left, Leslie Howard and an Ensign party were shot down over part of the route which we should have taken. It was well known at the time that the Germans thought they had got the British Prime Minister.
There now seems little doubt that the shooting down of the civilian airliner on which Leslie Howard and his business manager Alfred Chenholz were flying was ordered by Berlin because they were wrongly identified as Churchill and Walter. The unarmed KLM flight had taken off as usual from Lisbon to fly to Bristol. It had undertaken a similar flight without any problems on many previous occasions. At 12:45 p.m., while over the Bay of Biscay, the Dakota was tracked by a squadron of specially tasked German Junkers Ju-88 heavy attack aircraft and shot down. At the time, it seemed an outrage that a clearly marked, unarmed civilian plane flying from a neutral country should be treated so callously. But after the war, the commander of the German squadron based near Bordeaux revealed that he had been instructed to mount particularly strict patrols at the beginning of June and to shoot down the aircraft. The Germans undoubtedly kept a regular watch on the airport at Lisbon, and it was soon being rumoured that Chenholz, who had a resemblance to Churchill, and Howard, who was tall and thin like Walter, had been misidentified as the British Prime Minister and his bodyguard. Churchill later wondered why anyone should have thought that he and his bodyguard would be flying alone on a civilian airliner when he had all the resources of the Allied air forces at his disposal. But by the beginning of June, the Germans knew that Churchill was in North Africa and would undoubtedly make special efforts to intercept him. It is also believed that as a disinformation campaign, the British Secret Service had let slip that Churchill might be flying back by a commercial aircraft, possibly via Lisbon. With the German spy network on high alert, it is quite possible that a German agent saw what appeared to be Winston and his bodyguard getting onto the KLM flight at Lisbon, and without pausing to reflect how unlikely this was, passed the information back to his controllers. This would account for the heightened state of alert in the Luftwaffe unit covering the Bay of Biscay, and the readiness of the German pilots to attack a civilian flight. The shoot-down of the KLM flight actually came 3 days before the delayed Avro York carrying Walter and Winston and their party took off. And it is likely to speculate that their aircraft got through because of the false impression amongst the Germans that they had shot Churchill down. One can also speculate that Ultra may well have told British intelligence and Churchill that the Luftwaffe had been ordered to shoot down the Lisbon flight. If that is true, then a deliberate decision was made to allow the flight to go ahead for fear of alerting the Germans that Enigma had been cracked at such a crucial time in the war. Whatever the truth of these two secret events, there is little doubt that Winston's life was particularly at risk during the flights he made during the early part of 1943. And the risks would continue, for within a few months he would be on the move again. Little did Walter suspect that when he did so, his worst nightmares were to be realized. For Winston's next trip was to be back to Tehran, where a special squad of German assassins had been parachuted in to kill the 3 Allied leaders who were meeting there.